From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Susan Vita, the Chief of the Music Division, and it is a real pleasure to welcome you tonight to the first the first act, I guess, in an evening devoted to finding out more about the marvelous man called Roman Totenberg. And we have the great pleasure of having a wonderful panel up here. And I am going to turn the microphone over to one of Roman's daughters, Jill Totenberg, and she's going to make the introduction. So welcome, and I'm glad to have you here.
Thank you, Susan. I'm trying to be someplace where you can all see. Come up, come up. So, good evening. I'm sure that you heard the beautiful music on your way in, and that was our father, Roman Totenberg, playing Debussy and other pieces on a newly released CD. Sit down, Mira. Find a seat, Mira. This is one of his students. Find a seat, Mira. Obviously, I'm Jill Totenberg. I'm one of the three sisters, and our father used to call us the Three Graces. We're very thrilled that the Library of Congress has collected our father's papers, photos, music, videos, and much more to be part of the collection from leading American violinists, maintained by the Music Division. Among others that are in this group are Fritz Kreisler, Jascha Heifetz, and Isaac Stern, to name a few. On your seats, you have a program of the program is a little bio of our dad and how his materials fit into the library's collection. Making a collection like this come alive is not easy, and we have a lot of people to thank, starting with the Librarian of Congress, James Billington, the head of the Music Division, Susan Vita, who introduced me, and the wonderful Daniel Boomhower, who has shepherded this collection from the get-go. In addition, we owe a great deal of gratitude to our cousin Elizabeth Wilk, who has let the library have originals of all her family's correspondence prior to World War II, which is not easily accessible. Another person we have to mention is music historian Alan Evans, who has found a large number of our father's recordings we didn't know about and remastered them digitally and reissued some of them on a CD via iTunes and Arbiter Records. You can get the CD on Amazon. Buy now and buy a lot. It is Christmas. But Alan was a lot more important to us. He is such a brilliant man that anytime we had a question about anything, Alan magically knew the answers. Whether it was music or history, he knew the answers. So tonight's concerts features three musicians, two of whom have long connections to our dad. Mira Wang, who came from China to study with him when she was 19, and over the ensuing decades remained so close to him that she became known as the fourth daughter to us. Then she married cellist Jan Vogler. One of the ceremonies was at our parents' house in Maine, and Jan soon became a Totenberg son-in-law. And we would often find both Jan and Mira sitting and talking about music with our dad and talking about interpretations and gossip and the things of musical life. Mira and Jan are part of tonight's panel, and they will tell us a bit about what they're going to play. They're joined by the library's Daniel Boomhower, the critic Richard Dyer, who was with the Boston Globe for many years, and my other sister, federal judge Amy Totenberg. And of course, you all know Nina, NPR's legal affairs correspondent. If you don't, shame on you. My father was known to his most beloved students simply as Mr. T. They had a hard time calling him Roman even after they became friendly with him, and famous in their own right. And I'm taking your speech. So I'll finish and say, now to Nina. What? I can finish it? Oh, I'm giving Nina the floor. Oh, okay. Who has it? Keep it. No, it's for Dan. It's for Dan. But you need your mic.
Microphones, I know how to deal with. So, as Jill said, our father, AKA Daddy, was known to his students as Mr. T, and even when they got to be famous, they had a hard time calling him Roman. They still would refer to him as Mr. T. So, I wrote an essay when he died at the age of 101 for NPR, in which I said that he was as remarkable in his last days of life as he was for the rest of his life. When word got out that he was dying because his kidneys suddenly pooped out, people started, his students and former students from all over the country started calling and coming. And even from Poland and Paris, they wanted to jump on a plane. And when they got there, he had only one thing to say to them. He was not talking about dying, as far as his words that passed his lips. Dying wasn't one of them. So he would just say, "Play for me." And they played, and they played, and they played, and there was some of the most beautiful music in that house in the last few days of his life. And one of the people who came and played for him was Mira. So you played a long time, right?
Yeah, I played about 2 to 3 hours, and for some reason I just couldn't stop, and I should have stopped probably.
So he just kept saying more. More.
Yeah, I could see his gestures. He could hardly talk then, but I clearly saw his gestures without a doubt.
He was lying there, keeping time while students or former students played, and then sometimes when he would, about 2 days before when he had more energy, he would clap to pick up the tempo a little bit. So my father loved to play at the Library of Congress and would be so thrilled that the library wanted to keep his papers and make them available to the public. And he would be thrilled that he was, he had 3 daughters. He liked to see women succeed, and there are a lot of women in the audience tonight who have succeeded, including Justices Sotomayor and Ginsburg. And Justice Ginsburg, who had a stent put in 10 days ago or something like that, is back doing push-ups. So we're happy to know that. Dan Boomhower, you were and are the guiding spirit of this collection of violinist papers. Why do you think it's such an important part of the musical legacy of the country?
Well, we have such an extraordinary, when I came to the library, there is obviously a great collection here in place with the papers of Heifetz and Kreisler, Isaac Stern. And so part of our goal is to build on that, and adding the collection of Roman Totenberg's papers really does enhance that. One of the things that we see in a musician's papers like Roman's is their interaction with composers, living composers, and how they bring music to life. But we also see how they bring old music to life. And something we see especially in Roman's papers, I didn't study with him, so I'm comfortable calling him Roman,
Yeah.
is how music and making music is inextricably linked with life, and life and art are such, so closely bound together. And what a musician brings to their music is so informed by the life that they lived. And I think that's one of the special things about Roman's music making. And so these are the things that I think, we have this historical perspective that we seek to document, but there's something more to that I think is really important. Performers' papers.
I should say that outside of the Coolidge Auditorium where the concert is going to be tonight, there are some, what we in the family called peaches and cream photos of my father when he was in his 20s, from concerts at Town Hall and things like that, and famous venues, and I think some music as well with his markings and other people's markings. And did you find the White House program? Is that out there? I don't know. Anyway, there's some stuff out there that's exhibited that you can take a look at. We're going to talk about the collection more in a few minutes, but I want to turn to Richard Dyer, who for so many years covered my father. You wrote in one of your reviews of a concert that he gave when I think he was 89 that Totenberg represents a last link to the very different world of music making before World War II. What did you mean by that?
I'm not entirely sure. But I mean, a lot of it had to do, I think, with his participation in a different musical culture from the one in which he found himself in. You know, I thought, I met him over 40 years ago when I thought he was infinitely aged, although he was considerably younger than I am now. But there's also a real reason for this as well. That is, the 19th century in the history of violin playing saw the emergence of very different schools of violin playing. The dominant ones were French, German, and Russian, although the founders of all three were Hungarian, as a matter of fact. One of whom was Roman's principal teacher, Karl Flesch, although another of them was Enescu, who was Romanian. But I think the thing that characterized Roman's playing more than anything was how cosmopolitan it was. I mean, he couldn't belong to any school because he lived in so many different places. I mean, he was born in Poland, grew up in Russia, lived in Berlin, lived in Paris, and ultimately wound up in Boston. But there are a number of technical things that defined his playing that you don't hear so much anymore. One is the use of vibrato, for example. I mean, today it's a very thick brown gravy poured over every note and every phrase. He didn't do that at all. Vibrato was an element of characterization, and it came and went according to what he wanted to do. The other thing I think has to do, and the national schools arose really from the different spoken languages. That is, the way of playing the violin, the way of singing, the way of playing any instrument, arose from the inflections and rhythms and characteristics of the spoken languages of the countries involved. And the most remarkable thing about Roman's playing, I always felt, was this quality of parlando. That is, every violinist learns how to sing, but not many of them learn how to speak and to inflect every single phrase as if it had words, except you don't know what they are. So that was one of the reasons I think his playing was so completely communicative.
Amy, Judge Amy. Our father sometimes discussed the very, very different ways that musicians played and approached the expression of sound in the first part of the 20th century, and how that affected his teaching, not just his performance, but his teaching.
Well, I think this is just an echo in some ways what Richard has been talking about, is that he would say that you could close your eyes in a different era and hear someone playing, and you would know where they came from and who taught them. And so he said, over time, though, the sound, partially because, of course, of the use of modern recording technology, has become more the same and more technically focused and technically brilliant. But I think he was very concerned still, as he taught new generations of very beautifully technically trained musicians, to still recover the soul and meaning of what they were playing, that technical brilliance was not sufficient, and how to interpret that. And he taught people from all over the world, and in some ways it was teaching the language of the music still and what it means.
Well, he echoed that actually in an essay that he wrote that I had never seen, but is among these papers. And he wrote that musical works that are considered the classics of today but were rejected, panned, booed in their time. Beethoven, the Beethoven Violin Concerto, the Brahms, which was called a concerto against the violin, the Tchaikovsky, which one critic called so revolting you could hear it stink. My father wrote that at the time these classics were composed, they spoke a language foreign to the audience, the critics, and the performing artists. And it took years, sometimes generations, of affectionate labors of some performers, working on the music, working on the interpretation, adding cadenzas, to get the music to the place where it would be heard as the great masterpieces that they are today. And I wanted to ask our performers, Jan Vogler and Mira Wang, how is it that performance can change the composition so much?
I guess it's my turn. So yeah, I think in a way it goes both ways. If you think about a piece, a manuscript, and there are many bad performances, the manuscript is as innocent as before. So a bad performance does not destroy a piece, but a good performance, of course, brings love to the piece. So I think what we are trying every night is we're trying to communicate the manuscript to you, to the audience, and it's the greatest pleasure. And I guess if there are many performances which are inspired, a piece does become kind of a legend in the ear of the audience. And then we get to a new job. We get to the job to maybe reinvent the piece each time we play it. So it's, I think, first making it well known and then still keeping it fresh, which is as hard as bringing it to the, famous heaven of great pieces.
You have anything to add, Mrs. Vogler?
I think that was covered very well.
Richard, could you talk about my father's role in promoting contemporary music, which he did very assiduously, the Barber Concerto, for instance?
Well, that, I think, was part of his life all the way through, beginning in Poland probably with Szymanowski, whose music, was a tough nut to crack in those days, but he kept at it, and he played the first Szymanowski concerto to celebrate his 90th birthday. There's a funny story about that that's irrelevant to your question, but
it's a good story.
There was a terrible snowstorm going on that night, and so it was unclear whether the concert was going to take place, and I couldn't find anybody at Boston University to tell me if it was going to happen. So I finally just called him and said, "Are you going to play tonight?" He said, "Yes." He said, "I'm even going to drive to Symphony Hall because nobody will take me."
I think he was overruled.
But what I was going to say is that, he not only did it, but he kept at it. That is, the Barber Concerto was not successful when it was first performed. He didn't do the premiere. In fact, Barber, after the premiere, was so dissatisfied he revised it, and so Roman played the premiere of the revised version. And he did it everywhere. I mean, he must have played it 50 times, I don't know. But the result was that the piece gradually became one of the standard concertos, and he had a very big role in that. And he did that with works by Penderecki and Milhaud and a host of others. And one of the last times I saw him, he said, "Tell me about the violin concerto of John Harbison," which he didn't know at that time.
Yeah, he was in his late 90s. He was insisting he was not going to get left behind in the modern era and learn to do email. Of course, he only checked it once a week, but that's okay. The first time, in fact, that the Mio second violin concerto was ever actually played was in Mio's home, with my father sight reading the solo part and Darius and Madeleine Mio playing the orchestra part, four hands for piano. And then he did play the American premiere and went on to play it around the world. And he did that with so many pieces, some of which his children didn't particularly care for. But Dan, you and Amy and Susan Vita have envisioned using my father's papers in a new way to make them more accessible to other performers in this country and even around the world. So could you and Amy talk about that for a bit and what your plans are?
Sure. We are in the process of digitizing materials from Totenberg's papers, and among them are his annotated music parts. And what we hope to make possible with this is for there to be an archive online of different performers' collections of marked parts, so that you can see their phrasing, their fingerings, and how they approached the music. And we have an example of how this might look in one of our display cases in the foyer of the auditorium, where there were several options, but I chose one that I've actually found quite interesting because it's the Ernst Chausson poem, which is it's kind of like a concerto. And we have the autographed manuscript of that piece. It was given to Fritz Kreisler by Eugen Isse, the great Belgian violinist. And then Kreisler donated his papers to the Library of Congress. So we have the autographed manuscript. We have a manuscript part in Kreisler's hand. And then also on display in the case downstairs is Jascha Heifetz's marked full score. Heifetz traveled with, whenever he was performing pieces, he would take a marked score for the conductor and marked parts for the entire orchestra. And so
Controlling, huh?
Yeah, a little bit.
A little bit.
And then we have, so we have that on display. We have Roman's marked part as well. And we also have Joseph Gingold's part, and we have Henrik Schering's part, which we couldn't display. But that's the kind of resource that we're beginning to put together online so that musicians, both historians and performers, have access to this legacy of playing, because there are really distinct approaches that these musicians bring from their different backgrounds.
And it depends on also what your hand is like. So that my father used to often rework fingering for students to make it better for them. Or, as one day I was watching a class of his, and he says, this was like in his 99th year, he says, this is a master class, and he says, somebody's playing, and he says, I see you play that on the G string. Why do you play that on the G string? And the kid says, I don't know, kid, he's 20-year-old, and he says, well, he says, I know why you play it on G string. You play it on the G string because it's easier, but it sounds better on the E string.
I just think briefly the other thing is my father's life spanned 101 years, and that's an extraordinary life that covers the 20th century and all the terrible crises in life and world politics of that time. And you see the course of a life. He was very fully engaged in our world, and remarkably, unlike so many other people who have had to flee their countries, he brought everything with him and kept a record of everything. And it's just extraordinary to have kept that type of documentation. And my cousin also had some extraordinary documentation since she survived the war with her mother in Poland in hiding, Elizabeth Wilk. And so this combination of the musical history of the 20th century as well as the life history of the 20th century is there to be viewed. And I just felt that it was very important for performers and others to be able to get access, maybe to also see and engage with the library in this way, because I don't think that people understand what an extraordinary resource it is and what an extraordinary resource just engaging with somebody else's life this way is.
Certainly, the moment that my father started to become an American was actually before he was an American. It was in 1935 when he made his American debut with the National Symphony Orchestra, playing the Beethoven Violin Concerto. And just weeks before he had played for the King of Italy in a performance that was so formal that he had to back off the stage so as not to offend the king by in any way turning his back to him. Well, his concert here was such a sensation, and with so many calls for him to return for encores, that he was asked to play at the White House. So Amy, you've read and scanned a lot of these papers, way more than I have. So that's why in the family you're known as the junior archivist. Could you describe what we know about that night at the White House and what it was like?
Well, first of all, it occurred on January 2nd, 1936. My father turned 25 on the day before, January 1st. And I think that's an important thing to think about besides the just coming from Italy. And so he's in this excitement. The first thing, they come and they have this performance, but then they go and have dinner. And let me just say, the performance involved also a very famous opera singer, poet, other individuals, a very White House type of affair in that way, but you might think that was formal, but it was not at all. In fact, when they went to the reception and dinner afterwards, they basically is described as Eleanor Roosevelt serving tea and dinner on the floor, and Jake Garner, who was then vice president, had his shoes off and was stretched out like this. And they were making jokes with President Roosevelt about how much better Roman played than Nick Longworth, who was the former Speaker of the House, whose violin, which was thought to be a Stradivarius then, Roman was playing, and Eleanor Roosevelt was serving tea there, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful, totally informal event. And it's really in light of that that my father said, this was the country for me.
The papers and music alone that we found in my father's house, and for the good of the Library of Congress, he was a terrible pack rat. He kept everything. And we culled it as best we could, and the amount we sent to the library was, do you remember how many boxes? 60, something like that. And then we kept finding more and more. But as I began to read some of this material, I realized something I really had never known. It's the kind of thing that a father keeps from his children. That even though you're a great artist and a very successful artist, it's really hard. And so you see that in the early years in Aspen, when he became chairman of the Music Associates of the Musicians, there's this terrible vitriolic bickering all the time about who's going to play what, who's on top, so to speak. Or then after the war, there's a period where he was part of a group called the Alma Trio, and they were a trio in residence at Occidental College, and they had done very well. They had a great recording contract, a whole bunch of records were put out. And then suddenly there's this letter from the president of Occidental College, and it indicates that the woman who had underwritten this just decided to spend her money some other way. So it was gone. The trio was over. I mean, they had to go off on their own and do their own stuff. And I remember one day finding this record in his studio, and it was by a violinist named Andre Gabriel. And I said to him, "Who's Andre Gabriel?" He said, "Oh, that's me. I had a contract with Columbia, so I couldn't record under my name, but I needed some money." So I wanted to ask Mira and Jan, you know, today there are fewer venues to perform in. Is it so hard today like that? The
Yes.
blank look says yes.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's always been very hard. I think you try to get all the chances you have, and you try to give your best always.
Well, I think I have to also say there's an important element, it's called luck. And I think Roman in his life was very lucky, and he was always reflecting it. He was reflecting that he felt he was lucky. And I feel the same. I think we are also very lucky. We never actually think how hard it is. It's passion. You try to make music, and somehow it brings you somewhere. And I think we learned part of that from Roman.
Richard, do you have any thoughts?
About what?
We've lost him, we've lost everybody. About the idea of how difficult it is, even for a successful musician.
Yes, well, it always has been. But I and usually for the same reason, which is that the world changes around the fundamental things, which remain always the same. That is, there are artists who want to play, and there are people who want to listen. The ways of connecting them are in a perpetual state of change, particularly over the 20th century. I mean, think of how recording, for example, changed over the course of a century, or even of my lifetime. I mean, I grew up with scratchy 78s, and then there were LPs, and then there were stereos, and then there were 8-tracks, and then there were CDs, and now they're downloads. The technology is perpetually different, but the fact is that people still play, and people still want to hear it, and there's always going to be a demand for it, because the one thing you can say for sure about all of music is that it has qualities in it that can't be found anyplace else. That's true of painting and literature and any of the arts, is that they are unique.
Mira, I want to ask you, and Jan too, to some extent. You have to leave early to warm up, but Mira, you came to study with my dad when you were 19. You stood on, I can't imagine how many lines in China for how many months to get permission to come. And I wondered, you had met him, I think, once in Poland when you were playing in a competition. Why did you glom onto him that way, and why was he, in fact, such a great teacher? And he was a great teacher.
Well, I thought USA was a gold everywhere on the street to pick up. No, to be serious. And I met him once in Poland. Of course, I knew his name. When I was in China, back then we didn't have a lot of foreigners to come to perform. The door was rather closed. So we had those big records, like what Richard said, and I used to listen to the records. And I knew very few names, and Roman Totenberg was one of them. And I think Richard said many things that I wanted to say why I came, because he was from the old tradition, European tradition of violin school, under the influence of the, Carl Fleisch and Enesco. I just thought, what could be better for me to study with such a man, to learn the tradition of the violin playing and the style. And I think Roman's specialty for me as a special teacher, that he always brought the best out of each student. I think they were all individuals. They weren't like a factory made of a whole army of violin schools. Everybody was different. And he always spent that extra time for everybody, not just for a favorite person. So Roman always paid attention to his students.
We always used to be a little jealous, I have to confess, because these two and my father would sit in the kitchen drinking shots of vodka and having this great time discussing all of this music. And I don't know what they were talking about, but they were just...
We drank water. We talked about women.
You were quoted in the New York Times when he died as saying, "My parents gave me life, and he taught me how to live it." He taught us all how to live it, but what did you mean by that?
I think what I meant was, if I knew what I really meant, I was so fortunate to have met such a man and to be included in the family over the years. And I think I see how he lived his life and how disciplined he was. And at such an old age, I met him, I think, when he was 75 already, when I first came to the States. And into his 90s, I remember if I was staying at the house, he would always practice every day. I just thought, why does he have to practice now? But anyway, and if the students played and he was sitting at the nice dinner table with having a nice evening, he always said, "Now I have to go. I have to listen to the recitals of some students." Or if I was playing someplace far away, he would drive himself to go all the way, maybe 2 hours away from Boston to listen to me. And he would come with me in the beginning of my little career, he would come to guide me to say how to play that with orchestra, not to make so many mistakes, not to be nervous, and how to have that experience. And I think by knowing him, spending so much time with him, you really learn how one treats life, how you face life in difficulties, in good times. And he had such a humor all the time. And so we learned from that, what I did.
Yeah, and I do have to let you go, but before you do, would you tell us what you are going to play tonight and why you picked these selections?
Well, I have to be honest, the program and the fortunate thing that we celebrate Roman today that developed parallel, and we were very lucky that actually the pieces seemed just perfect for this event today for Roman, because the Tchaikovsky trio was written after Tchaikovsky had stated publicly that he will never write a piano trio. He thinks strings and piano don't fit together. He said, what a horrible mix the piano trio is. And then his friend Anton Rubinstein died, and in memory of him, he wrote this wonderful trio. And it's the longest and most majestic trio there is for this setting. So it's kind of ironic that he changed his mind so rapidly. And I think for tonight, we feel it is dedicated to Roman. This trio is dedicated to Roman. And the first piece we are going to play is kind of an unusual opener. It's a very intense piece. It's the last sonata Beethoven wrote for piano and cello. How he called it, not cello and piano, he called it really piano and cello. And it is a sonata which is beyond the idea who has the melody. It's just a genius construction of mixed abstract and non-abstract music, which speaks so deeply. And especially the adagio in the middle, the adagio con molto affettuoso, is a piece which is very, very typical of the late Beethoven, although it's the beginning of his late works. In the middle, I think very interestingly, maybe you want to say a few words about it, is a piece by John Harbison.
Yeah, I just saw John a couple of days ago. He was sorry he couldn't come tonight. He has engagement in Boston. And he told me that he wrote the piece, of course, it was premiered here and was commissioned by the Library of Congress 26 years ago. And he said it was during the time he lived in California. So he wanted very much to express that with all the beautiful beaches they served, and often, if not every day, he wanted to have the feeling of some slow parts of people chilling on the beach, basically to chill out. And then there are two dances in the middle to be in contrast. So you will hear some beginning of the slow parts, which almost feels like nothing is happening, and then dance begins, and then start to the movements.
Okay, go warm up.
Thank you.
Dan, you know more than most about making a living as a top-ranked musician because you've read all of these papers, or a fair amount of them. And you reviewed some of the programs and travel schedules of my father's when he had a group called the Totenberg Ensemble. I don't actually remember very much about it. I don't know how many players were in it, but it was like a very small orchestra that and you said it was a sort of jaw-dropping experience to look at their schedule.
Right, so the Totenberg Ensemble was something that, it was kind of a tradition that he continued from his teacher, Karl Flesch, where the maestro would perform with his students, and this was a group of students that traveled, and they traveled everywhere. And it could have been, partly that it may have been more difficult to get bookings because it was perceived to be a student ensemble, but they were performing at a very high quality and a high level, and they played everywhere. And I think it is reflected, you see, in his correspondence and in the work of other musicians, that part of it's like Jan was saying, that you do it because you have the passion and you have to pursue that. I had a chance to spend time with the widow of Ruggero Ricci this past August, and I was struck by her stories about everywhere that he played as well. I think he played on all 7 continents, even though there probably weren't audiences on all 7 continents. But that's what you see in the Totenberg Ensemble schedules. They were playing in every little town, and that opportunity, I think, to bring their music making to those different audiences, I think, was part of what inspired Roman and his students.
I want to turn now to the war years and how difficult they were. Amy, could you talk a little bit about how he dealt with that psychologically and professionally? He was sort of landlocked in New York because you couldn't travel. He did do a 6-month trip, I think, just before the war with Arthur Rubinstein, but by and large, he was in New York, and he was playing on the radio on WQXR. He was the music director, and but more interesting really is how he managed, because his sister, he had no idea if she was alive or dead. He'd gotten his mother out of Europe on literally the last boat out of Lisbon, courtesy of a sort of a rogue guy who was stamping everybody's visa. So talk about it a bit.
Well, I think I was looking at the archives today, and I was looking at a note he wrote about just his time, the last years in Europe, and I think it still sort of frames that. And he wrote that when they went to Paris moved to Paris from Berlin in 1932, he wrote that, quote, "The transition was at the same time very painful and very heartbreaking and full of hope that things would improve in the world, but they got worse and worse, especially in Europe." And so then he arrives in the United States, and on one hand, with this hopeful note that we talked about earlier, I mean, originally with this wonderful program in Washington and coming to the White House, and then he came multiple times before he finally settled in 1938 here. But he was desperately trying to get everyone and anyone out of Europe, including my cousin and her mother. Many, many letters you see, and the world seemed very dim. He said New York seemed very also noisy and dark to him at this point. And you just can imagine someone so cut off from all of the world he was in, even though he had some future here. And he talked about this depression that sort of began to sink on him, even though you would have to say he'd been somewhat of a little rock star in Europe as a young man, and here he's now facing just cataclysm. And I think, while he had this remarkable success in getting his mother here, he had lost so much. And it's in that context he meets my mother in 1941, and he says it's like some brilliant light had suddenly taken over and walked the streets of New York, and they were light, and everyone knew her. And it was, the world had transformed. And we wrote, among many other things, for my parents on one of their anniversary parties that they had met the mate of their dreams, and it seemed so corny, but it was, in fact, what saved him at that time, and returned him to his roots of feeling confidence and optimism in life, that he could move forward and not be a prisoner of the past and all that was lost.
Amy, let's go back even further to Germany in the 20s and the early 30s. Daddy, at age 18, went to study with Karl Flesch, and for those of you who are not violinists, Karl Flesch was probably the most famous and important violin teacher of the 20th century. And he was a huge influence on my father. So talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think the entire way he taught students was he was perhaps a lot more frightening, as you might say, than my father was to people, because there's the story of basically my father can remember being so terrified of being on the same particular piece of carpet that resembled what Flesch had, that it sort of stirred his memories of it. But putting aside that, because he was, I think, a commanding force, he embraced students in the teaching process, and they were not a different class, they were fellow musicians, and my father had the opportunity to play with Flesch, which was the same opportunity that he gave to all of his students wherever he was. He tried to include them in performances and treat them as colleagues. And I think this was formative because really for all the students about him who, over the years, and why they loved him with that degree of intensity, because they were his students, their children, his children, and his colleagues, and they knew that all that was there. And I think that that opportunity to play with Flesh, to be with him fully, was the beginning.
Dan, you found some letters from Flesh in my father's papers that are from when he's left Berlin. It's 1933, I think, 32 or 33. He's in Paris. He's actually remaking, connections, starting a career again. He'd seen the handwriting on the wall in Berlin, and he left, and he starts again in Paris. And he gets this series of letters from Flesh that are really quite funny. So tell us about them.
Right. So the first one in them, I think that's about 6 letters, and the first one is a really touching letter from Flesh saying, "Hang in there, you're going to make it." And so you get already this sense of what a sort of feeling of dislocation Roman felt. But then it does become slightly humorous in that Flesh then kind of spells out that he's in London at the time, or is going to London to teach a master class or a series of master classes for about 6 months. And then he's planning to do the same in Paris. And then he sends Roman on all of these errands to secure a hall, and then to find out how much he should charge, and where he should advertise, and should he have a particular translator, the individual who translated one of Flesh's books into French. He should get him, Roman should get this guy to write a article for the French musical press. And there's a particular moment in one of the early letters, Flesh says, "You don't seem to be responding quickly, so I need a quick response." And then 2 days later, "Thank you so much for your quick response."
So, Amy, before we quit, let's talk for just a moment about our mother's role in the Totenberg career, not just as the woman who lit up his life, which she certainly did. She was a fabulously interesting, smart, wonderful woman, mother, wife, secretary, consigliere, all of that, but she was also Gracie Allen. And so I thought maybe we would talk for just a minute about all the things that she did for him. When you read his letters, you can tell the part that she said, no, let's put it this way.
Well, I think among other things, she became Richard Dyer's friend too.
Yes, she charmed Richard Dyer.
She did. She was a wonderful cook, and there were soirees at their house. That's actually where I met you for the first time.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
One of those dinners. But she always seated me next to her because she liked to say things under her breath. And so did I.
Can you believe that?
Well, in terms of her career, are you wanting, or in terms of her life?
No, in terms of her with him.
With him. Well, they had great fun with each other, first of all. I think that's first and foremost.
They learned to trout fish in Aspen together.
And they loved that, and you can just see them out there that way. They loved to swim together. Whether in any part of the Caribbean, they would swim together and go out snorkeling. They loved to do about anything. They led very full lives, not confined to the music hall, and they liked to laugh a lot. And when my cousin El Junior was brought here after the war at 8 and was very, I gather, very isolationist and sad, they both got under the table and started barking as if they were dogs, trying to get her to change her affect. They loved to dance together. And my mother had a terrible voice, but my father still loved to hear her sing bawdy songs. and they loved to tell bawdy stories, and my mother loved to hear his stories, which were endless, but not in the way that they went on and on like you think of somebody telling stories, but he had a perfect story for any occasion that I don't know how it got saved in his brain, because I can't think of any, it feels like, but he did, and she
Jill
loved
got
it.
that gene.
Yes.
We did not.
So it was a great human friendship that traversed time. But I think one of the things that we know from many other people who are professionals or artists and who are confined to their craft, they definitely crossed all those borders. They didn't want to live a life that was defined only by the musical profession or by any narrow bounds. And I think that's, my mother loved music, but she was not a musician. And she was, we always said, a member of the New Deal Choir, and that was what inspired her. And he enjoyed all of that, and she enjoyed all the music.
So I think we'll end by my reading you just one stanza of a poem that she wrote one day in Aspen, which was actually, it was a 2-page poem. It was quite a long poem. It was to celebrate Darius Milhaud's 60th birthday. And it's a very clever poem, and I'm just going to read you one stanza. It says, "Whether Mio, Milo, or Milo, it all applies to the same silo. What's in a name, what's in a monica, when he writes as fine for a little harmonica." So, as I said, it went on like that for 2 pages, and she died. He always said that he would kick the bucket first, but she did, and he lived 16 more years without her, but he carried a framed photograph of her wherever he went. I always really thought he should marry again, but he just wasn't interested in anybody else. So with that, I think we should stop, all go downstairs, talk to each other for a few minutes, and then listen to a beautiful concert with Mira and Jan and their fabulous pianist, who really does play so magnificently also. He just didn't happen to be a Totenberg acolyte, so he didn't get to be up here. Thank you very much for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.